Hey everyone, it's Jeff Young, kinesiologist, and this video is on self-myofascial release or trigger point release program design following the FITT-P principle. And in it, I cover just about everything you need to know related to self-myofascial release. So let's go ahead and get started. Similar to aerobic and flexibility training program design, to design programs for trigger point release or self-myofascial release also follows the FITT-P principle, where F stands for frequency, I stands for intensity, the first T stands for time or duration, the second T stands for type, and P stands for progression. So as I've mentioned in the other instructional videos, if you fill in these 5 blanks, you've just created a program for yourself. So I'll go ahead and start with frequency and go over these one at a time. With frequency, it says initially daily, but the truth is that's a perfect world situation, and it kind of just depends on where the trigger point lies on a continuum of discomfort or pain, which I'll discuss a little bit more in the next section on intensity. But basically, your worst trigger points are usually going to need more frequency if your goal is to try to get rid of them. And your trigger points that lie lower on the pain or discomfort scale will require a lower level of frequency unless trigger point release is something that you just have the time and the desire and you enjoy doing it for some reason. But as trigger points diminish in discomfort and move from, say, a 4 or a 5 on a 1 to 10 discomfort scale to like a 1 or a 2 on a discomfort scale, the frequency can diminish along with it, so that you may start with, say, 5 or 6 days a week of trigger point release, and you could reduce it to 2 or 3 times a week, and then eventually to just 1 or 2 times per month for what's called muscle tissue maintenance. Having said all that, I've definitely come across clients who are just loaded up with trigger points, and no matter how much they roll, while it helps a little bit, they never seem to completely go away. So in those situations, the person just needs to decide for themselves how often they want to do it, and really just focus on the areas where there's joint pain so that it doesn't become overwhelming. Moving on to intensity, more specifically the intensity of discomfort. On a 1 to 10 scale, with 1 equating with very light discomfort and a 10 equating to pretty significant pain, the amount of pressure that you apply to the area is going to be one of the factors that determines how much discomfort you feel. And because of that, and because of the control you have on the amount of pressure you can apply, you want to seek out a level of discomfort where you would describe it as about a 4 to a 6, or in other words, mild to moderate discomfort. To give it a little bit more clarity, I describe the discomfort that you feel as like pressing into a bruise, in the sense that, as we've all experienced, when a bruise is fresh, you don't have to press into it a whole lot, and you'll definitely feel some discomfort. But as it's healing, you can apply more pressure, and even then you may not feel as much discomfort. So the point is that what you should be feeling should feel somewhat like pressing into a bruise. And the discomfort you feel is not only going to lie on a continuum, but it's also going to be dependent on the type of prop you're using, the amount of pressure you apply, and just how bad the trigger point is in general. Under the category of time or duration, the first thing you want to do is roll an entire area or a muscle group, such as your entire quadriceps, which is the front of your thigh, or your entire hamstring, or pecs, or whatever the case may be, to locate the worst trigger point, or the one causing the most discomfort. The reason why I say that is because a lot of people will roll, and as soon as they find a trigger point, they'll hang out on it, not realizing that within the scope of the entire muscle group, there may be trigger points that are a lot worse somewhere else. And maybe they don't need to be spending their time on that one, but instead spend their time on another one located within the same muscle group that is a worse trigger point. So first, go on a seek and destroy mission, roll the entire muscle group, find the 1 or 2 trigger points that are the worst. And once you found it, then you just kind of hang out on the trigger point, either without moving at all, or you can floss or oscillate the area for a minimum of about 30 seconds and a maximum to several minutes. So one of the main things to understand when it comes to time or how long you spend on a trigger point is that there is a minimum. If you find a trigger point and you only hang out on it for 5, 10, or 15 seconds, it's kind of defeating the purpose. So make sure you hang out on it for at least 30 seconds. And then at that point, it's again going to come down to how much time you're willing to spend, how much desire you have to hang out on it. And you could go up to several minutes if you want to. And lastly, under this topic, what you don't want to do is continue to roll back and forth over the entire area. Trigger point release is not meant to be a massage. I see so many people doing this at the gym, and while it may feel good in the moment, it is also defeating the purpose, because if you treat trigger point release like a massage, then what's happening is that you're on the trigger point only for a moment in time, and then you roll off of it because you're massaging the muscle group rather than trying to release the trigger point. So you're on and off, and you're not going to receive the benefits of trigger point release when you do it properly. Under the category of type, the main thing to know is that despite the fact that there are a million different types of props out there, from Theracanes to lacrosse balls and billiard balls and tennis balls and various types of foam rollers, there's really only two differences between one prop and another. One is how much surface area it has, and the other is how hard it is or how much give it has. So for instance, a foam roller is going to have a lot more surface area than a lacrosse ball. And in most cases, a foam roller is also going to have more give than a lacrosse ball. And the main thing to understand about that is that harder props with less surface area, such as a lacrosse ball, are going to quote unquote dig into an area more than softer props with more surface area, such as a foam roller. And the importance of knowing this is that this can provide a way to either progress or regress. For instance, in the world of trigger point release, so many people just default to a foam roller, which has a lot of surface area and a lot of times it has a fairly significant amount of give. And what's happening is it won't dig into the muscle or the soft tissue that you're rolling over as much as a harder prop with less surface area will. And what happens is you might not feel like you either have a trigger point or that the trigger point you feel isn't really worth releasing. When the truth is that if you went with something that had less surface area and was harder, you might actually change your mind and decide that that is a trigger point that's worth hanging out and trying to release. So the point of all this is to know that despite all the different types of props out there, there's only two differences between one and another, and that ultimately you want to experiment and not always just default to a foam roller in certain areas or a lacrosse ball in certain areas. And that by experimenting, it kind of forces you to get to know your body a little bit better, which is a good thing. And before I move on to the topic of progression, I want to say one last thing for this category. And that is that you don't need to spend a lot of money purchasing specific type of props that you'll find at Modell's or Sports Authority or on Amazon or eBay, where people are charging $20, $30, $40, $50 to sell you something that all you're really using it for is to press into some soft tissue to release a trigger point. They're laughing all the way to the bank. Instead, you can find props at home, like a dough roller, or for instance, cheap tennis balls. But the bottom line is, the only thing that really matters is that you find something that you're able to use to press into soft tissue and to either hang out on that area or oscillate it. And you'll save a lot of money by being creative and finding something at home in most cases. So now moving on to progression, and I'm pretty much just repeating myself from earlier. It's really good to experiment with different props in different areas to determine which one is best. Keep in mind that you may not feel a trigger point because you need to progress to a harder prop with less surface area for that muscle group. And then moving on to my 3 bullet points of additional information. The reason why I put the first bullet point up there is because the topic of releasing trigger points tends to be very controversial for some. Because up until recently, the existence of these muscle knots or taut bands of skeletal muscle seemed to be a phantom theory. But recently there has been studies using imaging techniques that have found the existence of these muscle knots. And even if someone were to argue that there isn't enough research to really prove their existence yet, there still can be areas of increased neural tension, which is causing the discomfort. And ultimately, besides potential decreases in pain, there are other benefits such as improved local circulation and increased joint range of motion, which means performing trigger point or self-myofascial release is never a waste of time. For those who have skin conditions such as eczema, psoriasis, and varicose veins, you want to avoid rolling those areas, as well as the head, neck, and stomach area, or areas where the pressure causes numbness or tingling. If that's the case, you're compressing on a nerve. It isn't the end of the world, but you want to get off that area. And lastly, for those who are not able to get down on the floor for whatever reason, alternatives to getting on the floor and using a foam roller can include the stick, or like I mentioned earlier, just finding a dough roller or some sort of prop at home so you don't have to pay $30, $40, $50 to buy the stick. And you can use that for your lower body while you're sitting on a chair or a stool. And then for your upper body, you can just stand up against a wall and use a foam roller or some sort of ball, whether it's a baseball, softball, or lacrosse ball, and press into the ball while it's on the wall. So that covers pretty much everything you know to design a program for trigger point release. Make sure to check out my video on how to perform a trigger point assessment so you can individualize your program or your client's program. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.